Welcome to Excel for Accountants, where we're going to learn about Power Query and Pivot Tables to import and clean data and build reports. Now, if you want to download this Excel file, and we have a start file and a finish file so you could follow along, click on the link below the video. Hey, this is our second video for the 2017 Washington Association of Accountants and Tax Preparers Tacoma Accounting Conference at La Quinta in July 12th. Now, this was our first video, and Excel for Accountants, the Power Query and Pivot Tables will be our second video. Now, here's the topics we're going to cover. And if you click below this video in the Show More area, there's a time hyperlink table of content, so you can jump to any part of the video. Not only that, but this list right here on the topic sheet is a table of contents with hyperlinks in this Excel workbook. So if I want to immediately jump to Pivot Table Notes, I click on that. It jumps to the sheet Pivot Table Notes, and there's the notes. Also, if you click on Topics, it jumps back to our table of contents. Now, we're going to start with Power Query. And actually, we want to get an overview of the entire process here. I'm going to click on Power Query to import and so on, and it jumps right to the sheet Power Query. Now, on this sheet, I've listed all the steps in this process. This is going to be an amazing, comprehensive example of how to use Power Query and Pivot Tables to build reports. Now, what is Power Query? For most of you, you've never used Power Query before, but it's one of the new power features for data analysis or business intelligence inside of Excel that has transformed how we Excel users use Excel to solve business problems. Now, Power Query, if you have Excel 2010 or 13, you actually have to download Power Query as a special add-in, and you'll have a separate tab. If you have Excel 2016, you simply go to the Data ribbon tab, and you find the Get and Transform group. Now, since Excel 2016, there's a couple different versions. If you have Office 365, then your Get and Transform will be on the left. If you have a disk that you use to install on your computer and you don't have Office 365, your Get and Transform will be on the right. Whichever version you have, this Power Query just transforms what we can do in Excel. Now, let's get an overview. What can Power Query do? Well, it can import data. And for our example, we're going to have 1, 2, 3 text files which got exported from our database. And we'll go look at an example of these files in just a second. But they're all sitting in a folder. And in Power Query, we have the ability to point to this folder, and Power Query will know to import all of the files. Not only that, but later when you get new data, you just put it into the folder, and Power Query will completely import it. And if you have any pivot tables pointing to the Power Query output, it'll all update. Now, here's our file. One of these files, each one of them looks like this. They have a number of columns. Notice this column came with product ID and category merged together. And in our final table, we cannot have them merged. So the second thing that Power Query will do is that it can clean data. It will easily split those two columns apart. The third thing that Power Query does is it transforms data. It will take each one of these individual tables and roll them up into a single table. Not only that, but part of transforming data is we can take a product lookup table and merge these two together to create our final table where we do not have product ID, but instead we have product name. Now, in the old days, we would use VLOOKUP to look this up and add an extra column with formulas. But Power Query allows us to simply merge into a single table. Now, once we get our proper data set, either imported into a single sheet or something new in Excel 2013 and 16, something called the data model, once you have your table, then we make our pivot table reports. And we'll see 3 amazing reports. We'll see a cross-tabulated report. where we have product and year. We'll see a monthly revenue change report where we have revenue, the amount of the change, and the percentage change. And then we'll see a gross profit report where we list revenue, cost of goods sold, and profit, and then build a formula inside our pivot table to calculate gross profit percentage. And all of this, what is so amazing is once we set it up, it's set up. And when we add our new data, our pivot tables will instantly update. That's the part of modern Excel with things like Power Query that makes Excel much more powerful than in the past. Now we want to go take a look at our start files. Now this is a folder. You'll have to download it from the link below the video. It will be a zipped folder. You'll have to unzip it. But once I double click and open it, there's Add Later and Start. When I click Start, and you can see the file path up here, these are the files. We actually want 2015, 16, and 17. Let's double click and open. This is a text file, tab delimited to separate the columns. This is oftentimes how we get data exported from our database or our company system. So each file has date, product ID, and category merged, units, revenue, cost of goods sold, and profit. So in this folder, we have 3. Not only that, but we have some rogue files. These files should not be imported. And Power Query has no problem simply using a filter to say, please only import text files. Now I'm going to click the back button. These Add Later at the end of the video will come. We'll copy these 2 folders, and then we'll paste them in here, and we'll see that everything in Power Query and our pivot tables will automatically update. Now let's go back to Excel. All right, step 1, we need to import the data. Now we're going to import the data to a new sheet, so it doesn't matter which sheet we start on. Wherever we start, we go up to Data, Get and Transform, and we click the drop down for Get Data. We want From File, and this is From Folder. Such an amazing feature. I click. It's going to ask me where it is, so I browse. And I'm very carefully going to point to the Start folder. This is us pointing Power Query to this folder. It'll automatically, at the start and anytime we refresh, try and import all files in that folder. Now I'm going to click OK. Click OK. There's an intermediate step. We do not want to click Combine. We do not want to click Load. We want to click Edit. And here's the Power Query Editor. Up in the title bar, it says Query Editor. Here are all of the files and attributes that it's trying to import. Right here, we want to immediately name this. I'm going to get rid of Start. I named it All Sales Tables Combine, and Enter. Now we can look. This column, the Content column, if I click not on the green binary but off to the side, I actually see a little preview down here. It's saying, hey, I see this text file. And then these are attributes. Now, the column we're interested in is extension. Now, remember, later when we refresh, there might be more text files. There might be more other types of files. But we only want the text files. Now, the interesting thing about all of Power Query is that it's case sensitive. And that's very different than Excel. Now, just in case someone might have a .txt uppercase, I want to make sure that this column always converts everything to lowercase before we filter. I'm going to click on Extension, and I could go over to Transform and the text column. Format, I could say, please give me all lowercase, or you can right-click the column header, go down to Transform, and say lowercase. Now look at this up here. This is a function-based language. Now for our example and introduction to Power Query, we're not going to go and mess with any of the code. If you're interested, there it is. This is the table.transform columns. Now we're going to do it all lower. Not only that, but it starts to build a list of steps that we do for our query. Now, remember, we only want TXT, so we simply come, just like in Excel, to our filter, come down here, uncheck Select All, and select .txt. Click OK. Up here in the formula bar, you can see table.selectRows. And notice it says the extension, that's that column right there, dot, and all in lowercase. If we had an uppercase, that would be different in Power Query. Again, that's very different than Excel. Now, here's another step that's been added. And get this, we're not going to need any of these columns. Now, we could remove them, but we don't need to because that double downward pointing arrow button right there on our content column does a bunch of amazing things. Now, when I click it, it's going to allow us to combine all the tables, and it will automatically remove all these columns. So let's try it. Now, when we click this button, it's taking these 3 files. It's first, after I click it, going to ask us what the delimiter is. Not only that, but it's going to use the first file and the first 200 rows of that file as an example for the process of importing and combining. Not only that, but it's going to ask us about the file origin, which is fine, and our delimiter. Our delimiter is a tab, and that just means what character separates each one of the bits of data for each record. Now, when I click OK, it's going to do a lot of things behind the scenes for us. I'm going to click OK. And when it finally gets done, there's a bunch of steps. And over here on the left, it built a bunch of queries for us. Now, in this introductory video, we're not going to go through all of this and what it means. I have videos at YouTube. If you search for Power Query Import Data into Excel or Power Query Functions, I have a bunch of videos. But it's worth just a moment. Sample file, that's just the sample file. It actually, in this step, built some code that helps it import the data. Then it built a custom function. And finally, it used that custom function on our 3 files to combine everything into a single table. Over here, here's the automatic steps, invoke custom function. And you can look through each one of the steps, removed other columns, expanded, and very importantly, changed type. Notice we have date, text, integer, decimal, decimal, decimal. Now, another thing about these steps over here, you can go back and look. If you ever have to change the source, you can double click. And notice I'm shooting this video, and that's the file path for my folder. So if your folder ever moves, you just open up Power Query and edit the source, change it here. Now I'm going to click OK. Click on the last step. We can click over here. This is the final table that we're going to dump into Excel. Now, I made a mistake here, but I want to show you how amazing Power Query is in that it will let us come back later and edit this, even though we've already dumped the table into Excel. Now, when you're ready to dump the table into Excel or the data model, you come up to Home, Close, Close and Load to drop down, and click Close and Load to. Now, in earlier versions of Power Query, this was labeled Load to. In the latest version, it's called Import Data. But all of the options are the same in either dialog box. Now, we can dump it as a table on a new worksheet or existing sheet. Or, as we'll see later, we can use only create a connection and load this to the data model. For now, we're going to load the table on a new worksheet, and I'm going to click OK. There is our completed table. Over here, we can see it loaded over 500,000 rows of data. I immediately want to come down and double click and call this all sales data and enter. Now, we loaded this into the Excel spreadsheet. And for 500,000 records, that's OK. However, the file size is going to be very large. After we do our pivot tables, I'm going to show you an alternative method, not loading it to the sheet, but loading it to the data model, which will dramatically reduce file size. Now, let's notice something. We forgot a step. We needed to split this. Not only that, but we forgot to add our merged column with product name instead of product ID. One other important thing is up here in the properties group, this is on Table Tools Design, properties group shows us the name of this Excel table in the Excel sheet is all sales tables combined exactly like the query name. Now we need to edit this, split this, and then merge the extra product column. Now this is called the Queries and Connections tab. If we go back over to Data, I have the latest updated version of Excel 2016. So my group is Queries and Connection. And I click the Queries and Connection button to open this up if I want to edit. If you have Excel 2016 and it's not Office 365, your Get and Transform is over here, and you will have a Show Queries button that you need to click to open this up. Whichever version you have, to edit, we can right-click Edit, or we can simply double-click to open it up. Here are our steps. We need to split this. Now I'm going to select Product ID and Category. To split, I can go to Home, Split, Transform, over to Split, or right-click down to Split, and we have a delimiter. Now we can compare and contrast this split delimiter to text and columns over in Excel, right? We have the delimiter /. Over in Excel, if we were using text to columns, it almost always suggests a tab. But here in Power Query, it totally guessed right. Not only that, but we've been wishing we've had this for years over in text to columns in Excel. We can split by leftmost, rightmost, or at each occurrence. We want to split by each occurrence. I click OK. And there we've split our columns. It added 2 new steps, split and change the data type to text. Now we need to rename these. So I simply double-click, and I'm going to delete the end part. So this is just Enter Product ID. Double-click, and we'll edit this. Delete, delete, Enter, and now this is named category. We can clearly see we have renamed columns. Now, we needed to split this before we can merge, because our lookup table is going to have a product ID, and we're going to need to, from this product ID, look up the product name. Now, if we go back up to Home, notice if I click the Close and Load dropdown, that's grayed out because we've already loaded it. Later, we'll see how to change that if you want to change where it's loaded. But right now, I want to close and load this back over to our Excel sheet. And there it is totally split for us. Now, we need to go over to the sheet D product, because we have this lookup table here in an Excel table. Now, in order to bring this into Power Query and then merge it, which will replace a VLOOKUP for us, this data needs to be converted to an Excel table. Now, I've already done this. I clicked in a single cell. I went up to Insert, clicked on the Table button or Control-T, and very importantly, I also went to Table Tools Design and named this. Now, if you try to import this and it's not an Excel table, Power Query will convert it to a table, but give it a bad name like Table 1 or something. All right, so I have this as an Excel table. Now I go up to Data, and in Get and Transform, there's From Table. Any version of Power Query has this From Table button. I click, and it imports this into the query editor. That name is fine. Those steps are OK. Now I simply need to close and load. And very importantly, close and load too, because we do not want to load this to a table. We want to say only create a connection. Anytime you're loading something into Power Query to then use in other queries, you say create connection only. If I did it as a table, it would reload it back a second time. Now I'm going to click OK. Over here in our queries pane, we can see 1, 2 queries. If I open up this, we have the option to merge D product into this table. So I'm going to double click to edit it again. There are our steps. There's our table. Now we come up to Home, and over in Combine, we're going to click Merge. Now, merge is like when you have a VLOOKUP, or if you know Power Pivot and the data model, it's like relationships. In order to merge, you have to have two columns that have the same data. Append is when you join multiple tables, one on top of each other. In fact, our combine that we did earlier was an append. This button is what you'd use if you wanted to manually append. But we want merge, so I'm going to click Merge Queries. There's our all sales table. I'm very carefully going to click on Product ID. Now I go down to get the second table, D Product, and I click Product ID. What this merge will do is it will be as if we have VLOOKUP here looking up this, racing over, finding the match, and bringing back the product name. Now, when you do a merge, you have to choose the join kind. Left outer, that's going to work fine for us. It'll take all from the first and matching from the second. That means if we had a product ID here and nothing over here, that transaction would remain. If you chose instead to do an inner, only matching rows, then if it didn't have a match in the second table, the actual record will be removed. So we want a left outer. So now I click OK. And guess what? It returns a table. And just like we saw earlier, when you have a green object here, if you click off to the side, you can view what that object is down here. Oh, yeah, there's a table with both columns. No problem. We have our expand button. I click. I very importantly want to uncheck Use Original Column Names, uncheck Select All, and I only want Product. Now I click OK, and I have merged the product column with our all sales table. We could see our extra steps here. Now, I do not need product ID anymore, so I can come over and right-click Remove. That adds a step there. Now, think about that. That's very different than Excel. If I had removed that in Excel, this would give us an NA error because it would be looking that up, but not with Power Query. I can totally remove that column, and our product is still here. That's the table we're going to need to create our pivot tables. All done with Power Query. We imported and combined, did some data cleaning, and even merged two tables. Now let's come over to Close and Load to. And it's taking a while here getting all 500,000 records. And there we go. There is our table with date, category, units, revenue, cost of goods sold, profit, and product. Now we can start to build our pivot tables. Now, for some of you, pivot tables might be new over on the pivot table notes. I'm going to go through all of these ideas and concepts and features in our video, but there's notes there for you if you'd like to read them. Back over to all sales data. Now, in order to do a pivot table, you have to have a proper data set with field names at the top, records and rows, empty cells all the way around, or the column headers and row headers. Once you have your proper data set, we can make pivot table reports that are summary reports that have calculations based on conditions or criteria. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we have category or product, I can simply, with a pivot table, get a unique list of all the product names and then do some calculation like add all of the revenue for each product. Now, our first pivot table report is going to be our total revenue by month pivot table. Now, in order to do that, that means from daily records, we need to roll up the revenue into month and year for that matter, because we have multiple years. Well, the pivot table makes that calculation easy with something called the grouping feature. Now, I'm going to click in a single cell in our proper data set. I go up to Insert and Pivot Table. I click on Pivot Table, or since this is such a common task, we can use the keyboard Alt-N-V. And just like that, we get our Create Pivot Table dialog box. Now, step one in building a pivot table is where is the data? If you have a proper data set with empty cells all the way around, it always gets that step right. The only other step is where do you want to put it, on an existing sheet or as a new worksheet? We want the default, so I click OK. Now, I want you to notice something about dialog boxes. Anytime there's a button that's highlighted, that means it's the default, and you can use the Enter key to invoke that button. Now, if that's true, I'm going to click Escape. If you end up doing pivot tables a lot, you want to learn this keyboard for when you are putting your pivot table report on a new sheet. Alt-N-V and Enter. That is fast. Now, this is called our pivot table field list. Yours is probably lodged off to the side. You can click and drag to move it if you'd like. Now, the first thing we need to do is we need to take date and group it down in the row area by year and month. That means over here it will list the year, then all the months. List the year, then all the months. Now, in older versions, meaning before Excel 2016, when we dragged a date field down to rows, it would show us all the dates, and then we had to manually group. But watch what happens in Excel 2016. Now, I'm going to grab this field. Notice the no symbol, not allowed to drag there. But down in the filter columns and rows, we're allowed to drag them. If we're doing dates, we want to drag it down to rows. I'm going to let go. And look at that. It automatically grouped by years, quarters, and date. Up here, we can click our Expand button. There's the quarter. Click Expand. There's the month. Now, in earlier versions, we had to do this. And this is an important trick, because sometimes when you drag a date down to the rows, you really want the date because you want to add daily sales. So if that's the case, you right-click and go to either Ungroup, or we can go to Group in our case and choose what we want. I actually don't want quarters, so I'm simply going to click Quarters, and now it will only group by months and years. If you wanted just days, you would use the Ungroup feature. Now I'm going to click OK. And just like that, I have just years and date. Now, one thing funny about this is that when you group, it keeps one of the grouped fields with the name date. We could see that over here and down here. Now, I don't want that in my pivot table, so I'm going to click in the cell and type month and Enter. Another thing about my settings on my computer, I have the latest version of Office 365 Excel 2016. And notice it came up with years and date automatically. If you don't have the latest version, then this says row labels, which is a terrible name for a report. If that's the case, you need to click in the pivot table, go up to Design, over to Layout, go to Report Layout, and you need to choose either Outline or Tabular. The one I have by default is Tabular. And then it will show the field names. Now watch this. We have years and months. A pivot table is just magic. I can drag revenue down to the values area, which is where we make our calculation, and instantly it calculated for each month and each year our total revenue. Now, as our first illustration of what a pivot table can do, yes, the grouping feature is pretty amazing. But fundamentally, what a pivot table does is it's not adding all of the revenue from that revenue column. It's doing a conditional calculation. Here, we're adding just for May in 2015. Down here, we're adding just for February 2016. That's what a pivot table does so simply. Some calculation, adding, counting, a percentage, whatever it is, with some condition or criteria either in the row area or later, as we see, in the column area. Now, when you're using a standard pivot table and not a data model pivot table, which we don't get to see in this video, it doesn't add number formatting automatically. Now, if we were in the Excel spreadsheet and not inside the pivot table, we always, when we want to add number formatting, have to highlight all the numbers. But not in a pivot table. You click in one cell in the values area and right-click. Do not select Format Cells. This Format Cells dialog box has all of the tabs. I'm going to click Escape. You want, in a pivot table, to right-click and point to number formatting. Now notice they mislabeled this dialog box. It should say number formatting for the field because we have the revenue field dropped in here. Even though they didn't name it smartly, we can tell it's the correct dialog box because it has only the number tab. Now I click currency. I'm going to say 0 decimals and click OK. Just that report there is amazing. We went from all of those files, combined them, cleaned them, and now we have our monthly revenue report. Now we need to add an extra column for the change each month and the percentage change. Well, pivot tables make that easy. We're going to drag revenue down a second time below sum of revenue and drop. We're now going to come over and right-click the value area. And there's two ways we can change the calculations. Summarize values by lets you change the aggregate calculation, including more options. Or for us, we want show values as. Now, there's a bunch of great features here. We could convert it all to percentages of grand total, percentage of just the column total. That would be on a cross-tabulated table. Same with row. We can come down, and what we want is difference from. We're going to do difference from the previous month. Percentage difference from. Wow, there's even cumulative totals or running totals, even percent running totals in. So we're going to select difference from. Now it's going to ask us difference from what? Month. Now that's the one we want. But notice we have month and years in the row area. I'm going to show you what happens if you have years. And I'm going to select previous. That means it'll compare January from one year to the previous year. I'm going to click OK. Right there, that number means it took this January and subtracted the previous January. Now, sometimes that's what you want, and that's pretty cool. But let's change it because I want from previous month. Right-click down to show values as, and difference from. I'm going to click it again, and now I'm going to edit it to show month. Base item previous, click OK. That is totally amazing. That means for any month, it just took this one and subtracted the previous. Right-click, number formatting. Something like currency. I'm going to show 0 decimals. Click OK. Now let's do this for percentage change. Drag revenue down below. Right-click, show values as, and down to percent difference from. We want month. I do not want the base as, and you could do it based on some particular month. I want it as previous. Click OK. Notice for that one, it added the number formatting for us. Now I want to come up here and rename these. I want to call this revenue, but I want you to notice something. It's actually not going to let us do that because there's already a field called revenue. So the trick that's been around for 20 years in pivot tables is you type revenue and then a space. Now when I hit tab, it lets us have that name. I'm going to call this change tab. Percent change and tab. And there is our report. That is amazing. Later when we drag our new files, this pivot table will update with 2018 and 19. Now I'm going to come down here, double click, and name this monthly revenue report and enter. Now let's go back to our sales data table. Now we want to create our second pivot table from our imported proper data set. Insert pivot table, or we use the keyboard since we want it on a new sheet. Alt-N-V, enter. Now this is going to be a cross-tabulated pivot table report. We're first going to drag our field product. And of course, anytime you drag a field down to rows or columns, for us it's going to be rows, it'll always search through the entire column and give us a unique list. That alone is quite an amazing feature in a pivot table. Now remember, there's 500,000 rows. We didn't have to manually go through or get a list from someone else to figure out what the unique list of products is. Now we want years, so I'm going to drag years down to columns. And remember, that's one of those grouped up fields, but it had no problem putting that criteria at the top of each column. Remember, any intersecting cell will now have two conditions. We're going to add revenue. For this cell right here, it will be fun fly in the year 2016. Of course, it's as easy as dragging the revenue down to the values area. Right-click, number formatting, currency, 0 decimal places, and click OK. Now, we're not going to change the calculation, but if you needed to calculate the average, the min, the max, right-click, and instead of show values as, which we saw before, you would do summarize values by count, average, max, min, and a few more down under options. But that's it. Notice that took us a few clicks, and we're done with this amazing report. Right there, that tells us Manu long distance in 2017, 15 million in revenue. Now I'm going to come down here, double click, and call this cross tab and enter. Now we want to see another amazing feature that's been around since Excel 2010. Now when I click inside a pivot table, we have column headers and row headers. Any intersecting cell uses those two conditions. But if we were to, for example, drag category down to the filter area, this is a filter or a condition that filters the entire table. Now I can come up to the drop down here for the filter, and when I select advance, that means it's going to filter every cell in the pivot table just to show the advanced category. I'm going to click OK. And there are the two advanced boomerangs. Now we can come up and select all, but we want to notice something about this. It's kind of hidden, and it's kind of hard to go and get those. It would be nice if there was a visual filter or what we call a slicer over to the side where we could just click and it would automatically filter it. But before we do that, filters still has an absolutely amazing use. As long as you have a filter up here and it's on all, we can, if our end result is to have a single new pivot table on a bunch of new sheets, one for each category in this list, there's an automatic feature that will do that for us. My cursor's in the pivot table. I go up to Pivot Table Tools, Context Sensitive Ribbon, Analyze, over to the Pivot Table Group, Options, drop down, and there it is, Show Report Filter Pages, because it'll create a bunch of new sheets. I'm going to click that, and we only have one filter up here, so there's only one item. If we had multiple ones, we'd select the one we want, and watch what happens when I click OK. In fact, I'm going to drag this down here. When I click OK, it's going to go bloop and add a bunch of sheets. So when I click OK, just like that, now we have a pivot table here for advanced, one for beginner, competition, freestyle, intermediate. I'll use my sheet scroll arrow, novelty, and then I'll go back to the original crosstab, and there it is. All right, so that's a great use for filter to show all those pages. But a lot of times we just want to analyze it here. So instead of adding a filter, I'm going to drag this filter off. We can just click and drag any field off. And now with a single cell selected, we go up to Analyze. And in the filter group, there it is, Insert Slicer. Now I can select a field by checking, and we want to check category, click OK. We can drag this. We even have our context-sensitive ribbon for slicers. We could say, for instance, increase the columns, change the size. We could even come up here and change the particular color. Now when I click Advanced, Competition, Intermediate, Novelty, unfilter everything, I'm completely filtering and slicing my pivot table. Now we can select multiple items. So for example, actually let me unfilter. I'd like to see advanced and competition. I automatically know to hold the Control key to select items not next to each other. In more recent versions, I can't remember which version, they added this. And so if I click, I can just click the ones I don't want, and boom, there it is. I'm going to unfilter. So that's a cross-tabulated pivot table with a slicer, and of course that great feature to show filter pages. Now we want to go back to our all sales data. We have our last report we want to create, a gross profit report. With a single cell selected, I'm going to Alt-NV, Enter. Now for this report, we want to show category down in the rows, product down below category, kind of look like our year-month report, but now we've dragged certain fields to create a layered criteria effect. And now we want to drag revenue down to values, cost of goods sold down below revenue, profit down below cost of goods sold. Come up, right-click, number formatting, currency, 0 decimal places, right-click. In fact, let me show you a different way. There's a one-stop shopping for everything to do with a particular field dropped in the values area. If I double-click the name at the top, it opens up value field settings. There's also right-click value field settings. But I can change the name, which I want to. I want to change it to cost of goods sold, and I know that that already exists, so I have to type a space. I can change the function here, including all 11 functions that are available, show values as, and down here is number formatting. So currency, 0 decimal places, click OK. So value field settings is great because it's one-stop shopping. Click OK. Double click, call this profit, number formatting, currency, 0 decimal places, click OK. Oh yeah, I forgot. It's polite. It reminds me. There's already a field called profit. Escape, add a space. Click OK. Now this one I need to just type revenue space and enter. Now what we'd like to do is calculate gross profit percentage, which is really this profit. And this profit is actually gross profit. It's the subtraction of these two. If you did the calculation off to the side, you see that that's the calculation. But I'd really like to take this profit and divide it in the numerator on top of revenue, the denominator. And I'd like to do that at the aggregate level. So this divided by that. Well, we can do that in a pivot table. Click in a single cell, up in Pivot Tables, Analyze, Fields, Items, and Sets in our Calculation group. Click the drop-down, and we can do a calculated field. So I click that. The name of this is going to be gross profit percent. Here's where we create our formula, and here's all of our fields. Very carefully, I'm going to backspace on that 0 down to profit. Double click, it puts it in. Division, revenue, puts it in. Now I can click OK. And it didn't give us the right number formatting, but no problem. We are not tricked by number formatting, even in a pivot table. Right click, number formatting. Over here, we can do percentage. I'm going to show 1 decimal, click OK. And there we go. Now, come down here, double click, something like gross profit report, and enter. Now, what have we done? We use Power Query to import, clean, and transform. We have our gross profit report, cross tab with the slicer, all of these individual ones, and way back over here, I'm going to move this monthly revenue report back in front. I can simply click and drag. You can see that piece of paper and that little black downward pointing triangle. That means that's where it will drop it. I want to drop it right before novelty. So there we go. Scroll over. So we have our 3 pivot table reports and our all sales data. Now the big drum roll for this video. Now I'm going to Control S to save everything. And now we need to go over to Windows Explorer. Here's our original folder path, and there's our files. 3 different years. But now I'm going to click the back button, go to Add Later, highlight both of these, click and drag to highlight them both, Control C, back, double click on Start, Control V to paste. Remember, Power Query is looking at this folder, and we excluded these other files by only including .txt. Now let's go back to Excel. Now let's look in the queries pane, 554,000. If I control down arrow, yes, there's only 550,000. GP, we got 35.9. Cross tab, this one will get new years, and also monthly revenue will get years and month down here. So we go back up over to all sales data, and I'm going to go to the data ribbon tab, and I want to use the refresh all button. When I do this, it'll refresh everything. So I click, and I have to wait a little while. It's loading over here, and there it is. Now we have 964,000. We almost reached the limit of an Excel sheet. If we click in our table control down arrow, sure enough, over 900,000 rows. GP report, we have updated numbers. Cross tab, oh, this one didn't update, and sometimes pivot tables don't do that, but no problem. Right click, refresh, and there we go. There's our new years. Over to monthly revenue report, and there we go. Back over to GP report, there's our updated number. That is pretty amazing to use Power Query and Pivot Tables together to create various reports that can update when our source data changes. Now I want to click Save. We have one last topic. We got to talk about the data model. Now I clicked Save, and I want to delete a bunch of stuff in here. But please, if you're doing this at home watching, hit the F12 key, which is Save As. And you want to save this with a different name. At the very end, I'm going to say Data Model, and Enter. Now we're going to keep everything over here. Notice right now that this all sales table, it is loaded, and it tells us that it's loaded. If I were to delete this sheet, it would then be connected through a connection only. And that's what we want to do. I'm going to delete for this workbook all of the pivot tables also. So with all sales data selected, I'm going to use the scroll arrow to scroll over. And when I see the last pivot table, before I click on Advanced, I'm going to hold Shift, click on Advanced, right-click, Delete. I'm going to say, yes, I want to delete everything. Now I can already see this is a connection only over here. I'm going to Control S. And now I need to change where this is loaded. And by the way, our pivot tables are gone. But I do want to show you and make one more pivot table to show you the dramatic difference in file size. The way we change the location is we come over and right-click. And we have to point to Load To. When I click Load To, it opens up our import data. We definitely want only create a connection. But now I'm going to check Add this to the data model. Now, all we're going to use the data model for is to reduce file size. Now, in Excel 2013 and 16, the data model exists behind the scenes. And using this dialog box or a normal Create Pivot Table dialog box, you can send your data to the data model. It's a behind-the-scenes columnar database which significantly compresses data. All right, so we're going to click OK. It says that it's loading. It has loaded all 900,000 plus rows. I'm going to Control S. And now, how do I make a pivot table? Well, guess what? We go up to Insert, Pivot Table, or just use Alt-N-V. This is the Create Pivot Table dialog box. And guess what? It senses that we sent something to the data model. So this option is available. Now, if you had a normal table like right here and it was in Excel, you could actually come and check this to send it to the data model. But that's not what we have. We use Power Query to import and dump it in the data model. I want to put this on a new sheet. Click OK. And here's the amazing thing. We get the exact same table. Now, you can tell this is from the data model because it has that dark line at the top. We want category, product, revenue. And just like that, we're allowed to create our pivot table, but from the data model. Now, that's all I'm going to show you for data model pivot table. We're going to Control S. And now we want to see the file size. If I go over here to Windows Explorer, there's the file that has the Excel table in the sheet, 56 megabytes. And here's the data model. We are totally allowed to drag and drop from that field list just like a normal pivot table, but the file size is just dramatically reduced. Now, there's a lot more to the data model. It's actually called the Power Pivot Data Model. And eventually, you build DAX formulas and things like that. But that's beyond the scope of this video. But knowing that you can save it to the data model and build normal pivot tables is a useful option and an efficient option in terms of file size. Now, back over to our Excel sheet. We saw a lot of amazing pivot table, data model, and Power Query tricks in this video. We saw how we can load it to the data model to reduce file size. Back over here in the start file, we saw how we can use Power Query to import, clean, and transform data and then update it later. And we saw how to build various pivot table reports, a gross profit report including a formula in the pivot table, cross-tabulated report with a slicer, a monthly revenue report where we used show values as and the grouping feature, all from our Power Pivot imported data. All right, if you liked that video about Power Query and pivot tables, click that thumbs up button below, comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you next video.